Charles II of Spain is dead, which leaves the throne of Spain and its large arsenal of colonies without a ruler, which means a war of succession is about to combust. Great European powers accounted for this beforehand, and there were a few possible successors in mind. Joseph Ferdinand of Bavaria, Charles' great-nephew, was considered but died before Charles. The choice came down to Philip, the Prince of France, and Charles, Prince of Austria. In Charles's will, Philip was named heir, but that would make France too OP and distort the balance of power, so there were routes. It's essentially everyone against France. Britain and the Netherlands are France's best enemies, and they support the Austrian claimant. I'm not going into details of the war, you can watch Kings and Generals or something for that, but basically France doesn't fare well. Two best generals of the time, Eugen of Savoy and the Duke of Marlborough, deal a couple of decisive defeats and Louis XIV has to consider peace. Then, the British realize that if the Austrian claimant wins now, Austria will be too OP, and they start making a separate deal with France. In the end, Philip is king of Spain, but has to renounce all claims to the French throne, and cede some lands to Austria and Britain. Meanwhile, war is raging in the north as well. Sweden is a European superpower for some reason, and the current king, Charles XII, is a military mastermind, who is a danger to all of his neighbors. Russia, Poland, Denmark and Saxony try to subdue Sweden, but Denmark gets humiliated, Poland and Saxony surrender after a while, and the Russians get eviscerated by the Swedes at Narva, though after the Russians lick their wounds, they beat the Swedes at Poltava, and Charles runs to the Ottomans, who join the war. Charlie overstays his welcome and is kicked out of Turkey, fights a war in Norway, and is randomly shot in the middle of the night. Swedish forces scatter, the country surrenders, and a lot of its territories are taken by Russia. Russia under Tsar Peter is the new up-and-coming European power, and after defeating Sweden, is a definite master of Eastern Europe. Peter's policy triples the country's income, forges a new standing army, reforms the government, and greatly westernizes Russia. His victory against the Swedes secures Russia an entrance to the Baltic Sea, and, by extension, an important place in the European politics. Russia extends far into Siberia, reaches the Pacific, and even colonizes Alaska. He builds a new, shiny capital on the coast called Petrograd. Peasants live in harsh conditions, but do we really care about them? Britain is currently a big player, but still not a European superpower. It has a solid navy, many colonies, but a small land army. The last of the Stuarts, Queen Anne, oversees the Union of England and Scotland, which creates the United Kingdom of Great Britain. Anne is the last Stuart, even though the poor woman was pregnant 17 times, and the throne was given to her distant relative George of Hanover. But a few of her relatives were skipped over, those being the Jacobites, barred from the throne for being Catholics. The Old Pretender staged an uprising in 1715, the Young Pretender in 1745, but neither was successful and they were left just to seethe. Britain entered into a period of non-intervention and peace under Prime Minister Robert Walpole. The economy recovered from the war and boomed, leaving the country ready for future wars. Louis XIV finally kicks the bucket after ruling for 5,000 years and is succeeded by his great-grandson Louis XV. The regency for the underage king was headed by another peaceful diplomat, Cardinal Fleury, who secured peace with France's traditional enemies and stayed out of major conflicts. Let's not forget that the Ottomans still exist and that they're still reasonably powerful. They enter into the Northern War and deal the Russians a decisive defeat at Prut. Then they enter into a war with Venice and Austria, which they lose, very badly. They lose Banat, Serbia and parts of Bosnia, and most notably the city of Belgrade. Turkish sultans tried to slightly westernize the country and reform the army, but they forgot that the Janissaries are actually the ones running the show, and a lot of them are replaced in various coups and schemes. Sultan's authority is much limited during this time period, and this will only change with Mahmud II a whole century later. Poland has massively fell off from grace during the 18th century. Great political instability, quibbles among the nobles, and its weakness in comparison to its more powerful neighbors, such as Russia, Sweden and the Ottomans, leaves Poland and Lithuania in a very vulnerable position. So vulnerable in fact that when King Augustus II died, European powers had a whole dick measuring contest over who gets to choose his successor. France, Spain and a few Italian states supported Stanislav Leszczynski, while Russia, Austria and Prussia supported Augustus' son, Augustus. Most battles of the war weren't actually fought in Poland, instead in Italy and the Rhineland, and Poland became an afterthought as France and Austria fought for their interests in Italy. But eventually, the Austro-Russian alliance won, and Augustus III became king, though he wasn't really done a favor with that. The German world only had one hegemon until this point. Austria was the unquestioned German power, and the House of Habsburg was the most powerful of European noble houses. Other great powers of France, Britain, and the Netherlands feared the re-establishment of the Habsburg Empire of Charles V, and that's why they, although not enthusiastically, accepted the Bourbon prince as the King of Spain. Charles VI, the claimant to the Spanish throne, becomes emperor, and his reign is plagued by one important question. Who would succeed him? He had no male heirs, only daughters, so to secure the claim of his dynasty, he issued the Pragmatic Sanction, which allowed his daughter Maria Theresia to become the next empress. Not all European powers accepted this, and some that did only did temporarily, and were waiting for Charles to die to contest Maria's claim. Most notably, Prussia. Prussia had been a minor power in the German world up until the end of the Spanish War of Succession. For his contribution to the war effort, the Prussian ruler was elevated to the title of king. Prussia had a strong military, so much so that people would say Prussian King Frederick Wilhelm I is kinda retarded honestly, largely incompetent, all the while having big aspirations. His son, Frederick II, didn't have that problem and became one of the most influential monarchs of the time. A brilliant general and statesman, he got the crown young and full of energy, eager to put a woman in her place. Frederick invaded the rich province of Silesia due to Austria's inability to stop him at the time. Seeing this as a good time to mess with the Habsburgs, France joins the war on the Prussian side, along with Spain and Saxony. Britain and the Netherlands declare for Austria, solely because the French are on the opposite team and a small local conflict erupts into a war of the Austrian succession. Since the ruler of Austria is a woman, and a woman cannot be emperor, the Elector of Bavaria proclaimed himself Emperor Charles VII. The war lasted for 8 years and there were many phases, ups and downs, but in the end not much changed except that Prussia got its way and controlled Silesia. The peace concluded in Aachen wasn't really a peace. It was more like a truce, because the powers weren't really satisfied with the outcome. Maria Theresia, whose husband Francis was crowned the new emperor, is largely running things in the country and preparing for a new war. She copies Frederick of Prussia in military matters, just so she could defeat him later. Alliances shift during this interwar period. Prussia concludes a deal with Britain, which France sees as a betrayal, and makes an alliance with the Austrians. Russia, Saxony and Sweden side with France and Austria. Prussia, feeling threatened from all sides, launches a preemptive strike into Saxony and begins the 7 Years' War, the first true global conflict. The 7-year war goes very badly for Prussia at first. Sweden attacks from the north, Russia from the east, Austria from the south. Berlin is taken and burned, the army suffers multiple catastrophic defeats. The British shift their focus away from Europe onto America, where they fight with France over colonies. The situation for Prussia seems dire, but then a miracle happens. The Tsarina of Russia, Elizabeth, dies, and her successor, Peter III, a huge fan of Frederick, immediately sues for peace, even though he was winning. He returns all lands to Frederick and steps out of the war. Frederick forces Sweden to accept peace and leaves Austria mostly isolated. Left to its own devices, Austria cannot win the war and sues for peace. There are no major territorial changes in Europe, and the 7 years of war and chaos ultimately led to nothing. Well, at least in Europe. In America, the British beat the French and took over its American colonies, Canada, Caribbean islands, and lands east of the Mississippi. The 7 Years' War will see Britain and Prussia elevated into first world powers, while the traditional might of France and Austria slightly fall off. Frederick II desires to completely avoid any further wars as to rebuild his nation. Meanwhile, Britain focuses on its much enlarged colonies. If you like what I do on this channel and you want to stay in touch with me and give me your ideas and feedback, you can join the Discord server linked in the description. Now back to the video. At the start of the century there was this great big fuss over Spain, but after that it was barely mentioned. So what's going on over there? Spanish Bourbons are important players in European politics, but they're drastically weaker than the Habsburgs were. However, this changes with King Charles III, son of Philip V, who intends to restore Spain to its former glory. Through a series of financial and administrative reforms, Charles managed to restore stability in Spain and to finally centralize the country. Also, he pushed his claim to the Kingdom of Naples and brought it back under Spanish rule. A proponent of enlightened absolutism, he expelled the Jesuits, strengthened the state's control over the church and the colonies. Unfortunately, his successors won't have a drop of his competence, and Spain would never again see such prosperity. Now that I mention, I should explain the term enlightened absolutism. Monarch's rule is absolute, but this is based on the principles of enlightenment, meaning they uphold the ideas of human rights, religious freedom, and science, no longer held back by the strict religious dogma. Many of the enlightened absolutists were in touch with Enlightenment thinkers. Most notable was the close friendship between Frederick II of Prussia and the French philosopher Voltaire. Good examples are also Maria Theresia and her son Joseph II, who reformed the army, education and finances, bettered the position of serfs, and limited the authority of the church. They ruled together until Maria Theresia dies, and even after that Joseph continues his reforms, though they do not outlive him by much. The most enlightened and the most absolutist of the enlightened absolutists was Catherine II of Russia. Her husband was Peter III, who fanboyed himself out of the 7 Years' War and into an early grave. Catherine took the reins and led the Russian Empire into a golden age. Her reforms were countless, and I won't go into them, but Catherine made Russia into an empire to be feared. She meddled in European conflicts, especially between Austria and Prussia and Germany. She beat the Turks and annexed Crimea, crushed the Cossack rebellion, settled Alaska, and managed to place her lover Stanislav on the throne of Poland. She was cunning, intelligent, but very aggressive. She had great ambitions against the Ottomans, which went against Austrian ambitions, and tension arose between the two empresses. Frederick of Prussia doesn't like all this drama and decides to calm down the ladies. Instead of fighting over pretensions in Turkey, why not just split Poland, as if anyone was going to stop them? A war is currently raging between the Russians and the Ottomans, overseen by the mastermind Generalissimus Alexander Suvorov, being fought on Polish soil, and, in order to calm the situation, the three powers of Prussia, Russia and Austria decide to split Polish territories among themselves. Poland tried its hand at reforming its very corrupt system, but too little too late, and the Russians and Prussians swept in and took even more. A Polish general Kościuszko tried to rebel and reclaim lost lands, but then their three neighboring countries decided to take everything this time. Before we reach the final phase of the century, let's mention three more states who used to be great powers but massively fell off. Sweden was a force to be reckoned with last century, and even at the start of this one. But after the death of Charles XII, the nobles stripped future kings of their absolute power and started leading the country themselves, but in an inefficient way. Ensued a period of dynastic conflicts, political instability, a humiliating defeat by both Russian and Prussian hands, and stagnation of the economy. Gustav III tried to enlighteningly absolute Sweden out of this unfortunate position, but is assassinated and Sweden permanently falls behind. The Netherlands also falls off, but not due to wars, but mainly due to its slow development in comparison to Britain. It stopped being one of the most important merchant states, its income from trade falls drastically, and with it goes its political power. Not to mention political struggles between the Republicans and the Orangists. The Netherlands are surpassed by their traditional rivals Britain and France, and the country is sidelined on the political stage. The Ottomans have recovered from the defeat by the Austrians, and in another war managed to retake Belgrade and other territories along the Danube. There was a long peace afterwards, and the Sultan tried to reform the sick man of Europe. However, the reforms were unsuccessful, the country stagnated, and it just became prey to the enlarged Russian and Austrian ambitions. Two wars between Russia and the Ottomans would be fought until the end of the century, both of which the Ottomans would lose, and Russia would establish its superiority. Another war was fought with the Austrians, and with the help of Serbian Haiduks, central Serbia was liberated and the war ended with Austrian victory. The current Sultan Selim III turned to consolidating the state after these wars, modernizing the army and putting through much needed reforms. Britain is ruled by George III and is kind of short on money after the 7 Years' War. To compensate, he started taxing the colonies a lot more. These taxes caused a certain number of colonies on a certain continent to become rather rebellious and declare their independence from Britain. This war costs a lot of money, and it really doesn't help that France and Spain are supplying the colonies. After a few years, peace is signed in Paris, and a certain number of colonies gains its independence. Following this streak of losses, the British public starts demanding change. Liberal thinkers such as Adam Smith and Jeremy Bentham gain widespread popularity, and slowly but surely Britain adopts liberalism as its leading ideology. Under Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger, reforms ensue and modern Britain starts to take shape. This century is remembered as a century of enlightenment. Based upon the teachings of Newton, Locke, and Leibniz, 18th century philosophers and scientists stray from traditional science and theology and go their own way. Atheism blooms among intellectual circles, and much more emphasis is placed on the human mind and spirit, with rationalism being the driving factor between human actions. Montesquieu and Voltaire, two of France's most enlightened philosophers, rebel against conformism and question traditional ways of ruling. There are too many philosophers and writers to mention, so I'll just put a couple on screen. The first encyclopedia was published by Denis Diderot and Jean d'Alembert and sought to compile all European knowledge in one tome. With the Enlightenment came great improvements in education, at least in countries that embraced the teaching. Britain, France, German states and Russia led, but even there schooling is mainly confined to the cities and wealthy. Industrial revolution happened this century, and this greatly changed the face of Europe. Manufacture was sidelined, and industrial compounds started slowly popping up in British cities, and by the end of the century spread throughout continental Europe, though industrialization will reach its climax in the next century. With all of these societal changes, traditional European monarchies had to adapt. Well, unless they were France. France stuck to its old ways and refused to change anything, led an irresponsible foreign and fiscal policy, and in turn suffered great instability. The reign of the 15th Louis was characterized by rampant corruption, incompetent rule of an incompetent king, lavish life of hedonism for the rich, and grueling life of struggle for the poor. Louis reigned for almost 60 years, and unrest started seriously brewing. His grandson and successor, the unfortunate Louis XVI, was more willing to reform, but too little too late. Taxes for the poor were harsh, the nobility and clergy still lived lavishly, and the king made bad economic decisions, such as supporting American independence, out of which they got very little. Taxes were increased to refill the treasury, and the bubble started to burst. The Third Estate, made up of citizens, merchants, and villagers, demanded an Estates General and proclaimed themselves the National Assembly. The king tried to undermine the assembly, prices of food increased, and Paris was engulfed in unrest and chaos. A militia is formed of unsatisfied Parisians, and the Bastille, fortified prison for the king's enemies, is stormed. Guns and gunpowder were taken, and the symbol of royal tyranny is torn down. The National Assembly published the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, a core statement of the values of the French Revolution. And really, it was a revolution. Slowly, the king was stripped of most of his power, and when radical revolutionaries called the Jacobins under the lawyer Maximilien Robespierre took power, the monarchy was abolished altogether, and the king and queen were imprisoned. The rule of the Jacobins was a bloody one, as all deemed enemies of the revolution were put to death by a shiny new concoction called the guillotine. Fear ruled France for a very long and brutal year. The former king and queen were put to death, and thousands died under the absolute rule of Robespierre. Well, until he also was put to death. A new age of French and overall European history began, and in the meantime, a short Corsican man was gaining prestige very quickly. Well, France made a very stinky mess, and now Europe has to deal with the consequences.